Hi everyone, my name is Sarah. Welcome to my channel and this week's edition of Scatterbrained, where I break down some of the world's most interesting topics you probably have never heard about. Today, I'm going to start off talking about the dead and graveyards, your favorite subject and mine. I have always been interested in graveyards, even though in the United States, an old graveyard is anything before the 20th century. But alas, if you travel Europe, you'll be constantly reminded of its medieval past, which makes one think, where's the dead? What did they do with all the dead bodies? If you go to Westminster Abbey in London, you'll find a lot of really important, really dead people. But what about everyone else? Well, there's a lot to unpack in that, but today I will be talking about one specific graveyard. This, boys and girls, is the story of Crossbones, the resting place for the outcast dead. Now, before we start, it's a good heads up to realize that before the 19th century in Great Britain and much of medieval Europe, prostitute meant many different things. A prostitute could very much fit into the modern definition of the term. A prostitute could be a woman who had an illegitimate child, a woman who was living with a man and not married. Pretty much if you were a woman and the town knew that you were sleeping with people outside of marriage, you were a prostitute. So just keep that in mind. If you look at a map of modern-day London, you'll realize a complex maze of streets and diverse neighborhoods. But even before the 19th century, London was still a very important city in Europe. Before the 20th century, South London was known as any place south of the London Bridge. It was known as a pretty seedy area. One of the most notorious seedy neighborhoods was known as Southwark, which is where Crossbones was located. Even though Southwark was known for its prostitution, it still was under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Winchester. A lot of the prostitutes of the area became known as the Winchester geese. Geese, one of the most disgusting animals on earth. I mean, come on, if this isn't the lamest name for a prostitute, I really don't know what is. And yes, the prostitutes were still expected to pay taxes, even though they were certainly going to hell. According to the local Christian doctrine, these women could not be consecrated, even in death. This was done on purpose. It was an institutional denial of an entrance to heaven. Prostitutes could not be buried in a church graveyard, period. We don't know when Crossbones was established, but we do know that by 1598, the author of A Survey of London, John Stowe, labeled the place as, "I have heard of ancient men of good credit report that these single women were forbidden the rites of the church, so long as they continued that sinful life, and were excluded from Christian burial, if they were not reconciled before their death. And therefore there was a plot of ground called a single woman's churchyard, appointed for them, far from the parish church." Besides prostitutes and their children, other residents of the graveyard included other people who were denied a Christian burial. This could be a criminal, vagrant, or anyone else the church didn't like. By 1769, the space now known as Crossbones was reserved as a pauper's grave, but due to overcrowding, the graveyard was closed in 1853. The estimated count of bodies is 15,000. And because most of these prostitutes were women from working class backgrounds, a lot of these women had little or no choice about their life decisions. She was usually taken advantage of by her superiors, her clients, or really anyone else around her or in her life. But even in death, these women were abused and mistreated. Crossbones was also known as a hotspot for nearby hospitals to dig up the graves of the deceased and use them for educational purposes. But fear not, except for a few instances after its use as a graveyard, the area remained largely untouched. But London grew, and upon the construction of the Jubilee Metro line in 1991, archaeologists decided to conduct a dig of the area. What they found was rather interesting. An extremely overcrowded cemetery, many of the deceased suffering from vitamin D deficiency, smallpox, tuberculosis, and osteoarthritis. In 1992, another dig involving 148 bodies from 1800 to 1853 was conducted. Over a third of these were women who passed away between 7 days and 22 weeks after labor. Half were children, 11% were under a year old, and most of the adults, they were women. Since these digs during the 1990s, interest in Crossbones has only grown. Today, the site is reserved as the Crossbones Graveyard and Gardens. It's now become the subject of poems, songs, stories, and now there are even various Halloween festivals that take place at the grounds. The entrance gates are decorated with messages, flowers, and decorations left from people from around the world who are hoping to honor the outcast dead. The unofficial group, Friends of Crossbones, hoped to make this space into a permanent garden. Today, if you take a walk around the neighborhood of Southwark, you'll usually see a lot of white-collar workers. There's a lot of office spaces, high-rise building, and prestigious and expensive food markets. You can never even comprehend a seedy Southwark nowadays. The story of Crossbones intrigues me. Not only is it a further example of how women were treated throughout history, especially in Western society, it's interesting to hear how London society treated their dead. And especially knowing that a lot of the people buried there were children, and knowing that a lot of these women had no options in life. It's a rather sad story, but it's also a story that needs to be told. It should be used as an educational tool, but also to realize that these women were people too. These women were routinely abused by their superiors and other men. They were constantly taken advantage of. They were the lowest of society. There's something that we can learn about today that comes from their story. I think it's really important to talk about these things. But it's also important to note that before the 19th century, many Londoners could not even comprehend a world outside of heaven and hell. So, despite these women's conditions, they knew they were going to hell. And to create a specific graveyard of those who were not consecrated by the church before death is a symbol to the city that these people were going to hell. And in the world they lived in, that's tragic. These people were outcast, and not edgy teenage outcasts, like your life was miserable outcast. I think we should remember that the people buried at these graveyards were people. Not only were they societal outcasts in life, but their society also told them they would be outcasts and sinners in death. Victorian burial practices were lavish and complex, but those buried at Crossbones were given little to no dignity, even in death.